Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, Intelligence-Powered Malware Hunting, sponsored by VirusTotal. I'm, of course, your host. Well, really just kind of here to introduce it and turn it over to Brandon pretty quickly, but it's going to be an awesome webinar. It is pre-recorded, so if you're watching this, this was recorded earlier in the day. Please do type any and all questions into the chat or question function within GoToWebinar. We will collect those and respond to the ones that are Security Weekly related will respond to, and then the other ones will be turned over to VirusTotal so that they can answer any and all questions you might have. The most popular question that we get from the Security Weekly side is, will the slides in this video be available? Absolutely. Everyone who registers for our webcasts gets a copy of all the materials, including the slides, including the video as well. So you can go back and watch this at any time, provided that you've registered. And then it depends on how we do the webcast. Is if you didn't register, I guess if you didn't register, you're really not listening right now. So that doesn't apply to you. But I do want to introduce Brandon Levine. Did I say that correctly? It is Levine, right?
Yeah, you got it.
He's the head of Applied Intelligence at Chronicle, which is the company that Google created, right? Or funded? It's a Google Can you explain
that? It's actually a moonshot that was spun out from X, which is the moonshot factory. So we matured earlier this year and graduated.
Yeah.
So we're now an independent company underneath the Alphabet umbrella.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And then VirusTotal, which was bought by Google previously and was owned by Google, rolled into Chronicle when they became the independent company.
I gotcha. So now with VirusTotal, you've got free offerings and some commercial offerings, and you're going to explain that as the first part of your presentation, yep. Brandon.
Yep,
and then some really cool stuff after that. So I'm just going to talk really quick about my positive experience with VirusTotal, a little bit about automation and how it can tie in, as I've seen VirusTotal worked into actually DF Labs' security automation and orchestration platform, which I thought was a fantastic use case. I'll talk a little bit about that. I won't spend too much time. I want to turn it over to Brandon then, who will explain the free and paid various offerings from VirusTotal, and give us really 4 kind of case studies or examples of finding samples of malware, alert triage, IOC expansion and pivoting, and of course threat hunting. So yeah, Brandon, let's move forward and just kind of give my account of an incident where I, unfortunately, due to my own mistake, had to use VirusTotal because basically we got pwned, right? This was from, I described this in a presentation that I gave earlier in the year. It was actually April 1st, which is kind of weird that it was April Fool's Day, but basically we noticed a massive amount of traffic coming out of one of our AWS instances. And after a little bit of investigation, we realized that there was a rogue Docker container running on one of our Docker servers that was basically DDoSing someone else on the internet. So they pissed off someone, right? And Brandon, I know you've Allison very well. I'm sure she could probably tell you exactly who that was and why they were mad at them and the name of their cat. But in this case, I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. And we see this today. Oftentimes it hits the news more and more as when people run rogue Docker containers, they'll typically mine cryptocurrency or do the DDoS attack. I think more so crypto mining today, Brandon. Is that what you're observing?
There's been a shift since probably the beginning of this year, really, where you sort of saw the rise of crypto miners.
Yep.
You saw people now taking advantage of the same vulnerabilities, the same automated hack tools or automated scan tools and vulnerability tools to actually drop what was traditionally a DDoS payload like GAFGit or whatever. Are now dropping usually a Monero miner, seems to be one of the most popular, something based on XMR, which is open source on GitHub, cross-compilable and stuff like that. So
interesting.
Typically they now take advantage of these beefy servers to mine cryptocurrency rather than DDoSing, because DDoSing, what they'll do is they'll just perform reflective attacks. So the power of the server is not really being used that well.
Correct. Yep. So yeah, I did notice this, and apparently I didn't know what I was doing, right? Because when I set up Docker, after I was looking through the logs, I did get an error about a container called GoGo. which is kind of interesting. I'll explain that. And like my heart skipped a beat when I read that because we use certain names of servers, and one of those happens to be GoGo, and it comes from the movie Kill Bill, and so you'll see a little more about that. But the other error that I saw in the logs was from Docker that says, hey, you've bound basically Docker to an IP address, and you haven't set up any security in the --TLS verify, so you haven't set up a certificate rather, to protect basically the Docker API. And I obviously didn't know what I was doing. The log told me that I didn't know what I was doing. So, I mean, no harm, no foul on the Docker team. So after digging around in Docker a little longer, I found that from a repository, there was a container called GoGo that was uploaded to my Docker instance. And essentially what I did was I exposed my Docker API. So basically we had a hardware failure on a local server. And I said, well, now is as good a time as any to move to the cloud so we don't have to worry about hardware failures anymore. And so we pushed our application into the cloud. I had already put it inside of Docker. We pushed it to the cloud in a hurry, right? Because this is software that we use every day here at Security Weekly. And realized that, after that we had left the Docker API open and exposed to the internet. And lo and behold, when you do that, it's kind of like leaving an open S3 bucket, or, back in the day, if you left an open FTP server, it's like the same thing, Brandon, that we've seen for years, right? Anytime you put up a service with no authentication or easily bypassed authentication, attackers are scanning the internet for that and abusing it. And that's essentially what happened to us.
Yeah, turning a box on with default configs or no auth is terrifying.
Yes.
Probably mean time to compromise used to be somewhere under 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It's probably significantly faster now. I would estimate somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes for a box to just get popped automatically.
Right. So I managed to get a copy of the container because it was on my system, and I started looking at some of the binaries. Now, two that stuck out to me. And, Brandon, how you describe your processes, right? You're just kind of looking at what looks suspicious. And there was a Java binary, but the binary was only 1.1 meg. And that was suspicious to me because the Java binary is typically a lot larger than that. So I pulled that binary. And then there was another one called Pythno, which was Python spelled wrong. I was like, well, that's pretty obvious. So I'm like, well, let me upload these to VirusTotal and see what I'm dealing with. And, really, this was the only screenshot I really needed to look at. Was basically I uploaded to VirusTotal, and it told me like almost 24 AV detection engines detected as some type of malware. I was like, okay, I'm not dealing with the most sophisticated attackers on the planet. And it was not very sophisticated malware. Obviously, it wasn't trying to do anything to evade or much to evade detection. So that was, in Brandon, it was kind of interesting. This is what I thought of as what VirusTotal provided me. I'm like, it's going to tell me what the AV and endpoint engines, think about this particular sample, right?
Yep, which is something we provided for free for almost 14 years now.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. And then I think I see where you're going with the next part.
Yeah, and then I noticed all those other tabs, right? And I was like, well, what's that? I'm like, wow. Now I don't even have to worry about like reverse engineering this binary or doing anything with it. VirusTotal just did all that for me. And I was like, I took one look at this particular screen, and it told me all the processes that it was creating, the shell commands that it was running, and some of the actions. And when you look at the actions, you can see packet attack and attack UDP and attack SYN. I was like, well, this is some lame malware that's basically launching, distributed denial of service or a denial of service attack by looking at that. I was like, doesn't look like there's anything else, going on here that would cause any type of further investigation to determine the purpose of this malware based on the two pieces of information basically that I had. Now, there was really lame malware that got caught by most engines, and the actions that it was doing were all pretty much related to performing some type of denial of service attack. So that was my very limited use case, Brandon. And again, I think it speaks to probably your first use case, right? I had some malware, and I just wanted to get a sense of, is this something that I can go on about my day and not worry about after I clean it up? Or is this something where I have to call a really big incident response firm and I've got a real problem and it's a targeted attack, right? And very, very quickly, it took, less than a minute to upload and analyze it, and then maybe a couple of minutes to me look at some of these screens to go, it's the first case, right? This is really lame malware. I'm going to clean it up and move on with my life. And now I've got something cool to talk about on the show and disclose it. Yes, we had a breach. Yes, we analyzed it, and it was really lame. And you shouldn't leave Docker APIs exposed to the internet is basically the lesson learned here. So,
yeah, man. I mean, that in a nutshell is what the majority of people are familiar with as far as VirusTotal goes. And that's something, like I said, we've offered for 14 years, and it's not going away anytime.
Yep.
It's really what the foundations of the company is built on, is building this security community. We want to provide anybody, anywhere, the amount of information they need to make an appropriate decision. Like we partner with all these AV partners and all of these EDR firms to help provide as much information as possible to make an accurate decision. And that's, to me, it was a godsend when I was a SOC analyst all these years ago when we first met.
Yeah.
And we'll go over some of the additional use cases coming up, of course.
Yeah, and I just have a quick note here basically about automation, right? So the case I described, we have one primary application that we use here at Security Weekly. It's broken up into a couple of Docker containers and a backend database. And it's one application. We have one developer, and it's awesome, and we love working with it. But obviously, we're a smaller organization. If you're in an enterprise, you've now got to do what I just did at scale, right? And handle thousands maybe of applications, tens of thousands of end user desktops, thousands of servers, millions of connections, respond to all different types of malware, potential incidents that may involve malware. And how do you do that? And it's interesting. I look back, we talk about threat hunting. And some of the things that I used to do, this actually comes from when I used to work for a university. This article was published in like maybe 2006-ish, around there. You can read my original article. It talked about this tool called IP Audit. Essentially what IP Audit would do was read all of the network traffic from a spam port and present me a NetFlow-like kind of analysis of that traffic, so that when I sat down at my desk in the day when I worked for the university, I could look at it and say, okay, for the last 24-hour period, show me the top host that connected to the most remote hosts. Typically, that was something that I needed to pay attention to at the university. Now, it was still manual, right? I still had to go investigate that host. I still had to maybe go physically visit that host to get an image of it, to pull the malware off it, manually upload it to VirusTotal, look at its traffic patterns from the IP audit tool, coupled with the malware and any other information that I had, piece it all together, make the decision of who I file the ticket with, what actions I might take in the firewall. I may file a ticket with a desktop group. I may file a ticket with a network group to block this host, to turn off the port. All of that's a very manual process. Today, some of the better, obviously much better use cases, and I'm kind of jealous that everyone today working, as a SOC analyst potentially has much better tools at their disposal than I did, back in the early 2000s.
I sure hope they do.
Right. And so where I saw this come into play was actually one of our sponsors, DF Labs, right? They've got a security orchestration and automation workflow that is looking into logs and looking at sources. And if they see maybe a piece of malware or something else, that they can take that piece of information, they can automatically upload it to VirusTotal, they can get those results down, they can then bring it to a human that just looks at that information and can make a decision and say, yeah, that's bad, go do the next step in my playbook. And the next step in the playbook is to automatically file those tickets, to automatically talk out to your firewall, to block that traffic, to maybe automatically trigger something in that endpoint detection and response product you might have on that endpoint. And that all happens in an automated fashion. Now, there's still a human being at certain points making decisions, but the process that I did, 10 plus years ago, now largely is part of a workflow in most organizations today. And it also, the one that I saw was a great use case. And I'm sure you see a lot of customers, Brandon, using VirusTotal inside of their automated processes and orchestration like that today.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially for data that feeds the traditional tier one sort of analysts, the guys who are getting just inundated with
Mm,
everything, dealing with the similar, alerts,
right.
dealing with the actual triage stuff. Yeah, that's a great thing because you really want those guys to have eyes on the alerts. So you want those alerts to be populated with as much data as possible, and that's a very common use case
Yep.
as far as our customers go. To just automate that against the API. We'll do domains, IPs, full URIs, and hashes. Shout out to all of my vendors that still use MD5. Stop.
Hmm.
But we do support MD5, SHA-1, and SHA-256.
Awesome.
So all those things, and then you can get all of that relational data that you saw when you clicked
Yep.
on those other tabs. You can automate all of that as well and say, hey, here's the full scope.
Hmm.
I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but it's exciting to automate these types of things because I remember my workflow at my previous stock job,
Yeah.
and I had 15 minutes to go and delve and find everything I could.
Hmm.
Now having it automatically there in front of you just would have saved me a lot of time and a lot of
Absolutely.
heartache.
Yeah, so for a history lesson, you can go read my article on an introduction to IP audit, which it's interesting. A lot of what I talked about in that article was threat hunting, which Brandon's gonna talk about. But it was without a lot of those contexts and tools that we have at our disposal today. So, Brandon, gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, so we've already gone over the title of this stuff. I'm Brandon Levine. I'm representing VirusTotal, and this is Security Weekly. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. Um, you can go back to the About Me really quick
Hmm.
just to flash it up. This is about me. I'm the head of applied intelligence here at Chronicle. Which is the which VirusTotal is a brand underneath of. I'm a former stock analyst, as I've referenced. I've also been the founding member of multiple incident handler, incident response, and threat research organizations. I've been a speaker at multiple B-sides, at least one of which that you hosted, B-sides
Yes,
Rhode Island.
absolutely.
And I have multiple threat-focused publications. So you can Google the name. You'll see a ton of publications ranging from crimeware to ransomware to APT to pretty much anything out there that I've covered in the past. And I have the normal alphabet soup after my name, but nobody really cares about that anyway. So we can move on.
Mm,
So we'll go over the agenda really quick. We will quickly go over who is VirusTotal and what is VirusTotal Intelligence, just so we can get on the same page and understand where I'm coming from, what I'm going to talk about, and then we'll move into how to integrate VirusTotal in your investigations and why. One of the things that we see most commonly is that people understand that VirusTotal, like the data, like having 14 years of malware data, 2 billion samples, people understand that that is useful. They don't
mhm.
necessarily understand how to apply that. And that's hopefully something that I can shed some light on too, because that's a whole different exercise. That's a very different exercise than what people are traditionally used to. And then we'll go into the use cases, which is the meat and potatoes of this talk. We'll move on. So VirusTotal, as I've mentioned, is it's a partnership between 70 plus antivirus engines. We just added a new one last week, so we are actively working with up and coming and startups and anybody that is out there that is in the market space. We are happy to work with,
Yeah, Brandon, I
including
was going to
some.
ask you that. We say antivirus engines, and I think when I hear that, right, I think of the major players that have been around for 20 years or 15 to 20 years. But
Mhm.
as you said, you're also taking in the new ones too. There's a ton of endpoint security vendors,
Oh
right?
yeah.
I think many of us have our favorites, of course. I'm biased as well as we have sponsors in that space. But it's not just traditional antivirus, right? It's the endpoint security companies that have detection engines. You're working with them.
That's correct. Especially a number of the larger EDR companies and even some of the smaller ones are
Hmm.
also onboarded as well. And they are required to submit a very similar sort of engine as to what they're using in their commercial product. Though, obviously, for responsiveness, as you said, it takes only about 30 seconds to get things scanned. So, some of the capabilities and the feature sets of the scanner engines that are used on VirusTotal are not the same as what a full commercial deployment
That's a good
is,
point.
which is something that should we do have to reiterate every so often, but it is in fact the case.
Hmm.
We are a global malware intelligence service. We have over 2 billion malware samples spanning back 14 years. It's something like 5 petabytes compressed. And when that's decompressed, it's something like 50 petabytes. The scale is
Wow.
staggering. It's ridiculous. I forgot to update this slide. We actually see about 2 million files uploaded a day, whereas about 1 million of them are net new.
Wow.
And then 3 million domains, URLs, and IPs every single day that we see. And those are all submittable via API. Anything that I talk about today that I don't explicitly mention as like not possible via the API is in fact possible via API. Everything you see in the UI you can do automatically. So we have some basic and advanced research capabilities. As far as what everybody seems to know, anybody, anywhere, any place can upload anything to the platform, and that's our crowdsourced verdicts. And you can get all of that information free. You can even automate against that if you prefer to use a command line and parse JSON,
Hmm.
3 or 4 lines of Python. All you need is a VirusTotal account for free. Just sign up for a VirusTotal account, and you can run those queries 4 times per minute. That's the only limitation.
Hmm.
Obviously, for larger shops, you're going to blow that out of the water.
Hmm.
And then we have, for our paid services, our subscriber services, we have threat hunting, some additional IR type of capabilities, some in-depth investigations, and some relationship analysis capabilities. And I'm required to flash our new cool logos for our new services that are rolling into VirusTotal Enterprise. So that's
Very
VirusTotal
nice.
Intelligence, VirusTotal Hunting, VirusTotal Graph, and then the new VirusTotal API, which the old API is not going away. Don't worry, those of you who've automated against it.
Hmm.
But there's a new V3 API that is immensely powerful and gives you much better data.
Yeah, I like how
So,
you have the APIs available in parallel. That's nice.
yep. We understand that people obviously have very critical workflows that are built
Yes.
on that, but we want to see people start moving over to the V3 APIs just because there's a lot more data and it's much better formatted, and they're actually much faster.
Awesome.
So
Those are all
ultimately,
good
they'll work
reasons
out.
to move.
Yeah, for sure. And then we'll move on. So, what is VirusTotal Intelligence? So, this was traditionally what was the paid product for VirusTotal. We're basically giving you the Google of malware. We extract and index sandbox behavior, network information, macros, PE imports and exports, authenticated signatures, and tons of other data. Anything that you could see in the EXIF tool or anything that you could see in sort of a file format parser, we store.
Hmm.
So, what we provide is the ability to search through that data set. And that's
And so,
all accessible.
Brandon, I'm sorry, with the
Yep.
Office macros, so I can upload document, like what document types can I upload to VirusTotal? And then is there a difference between free and paid in terms of the document kind of analysis?
No difference.
Okay.
The only difference is that you obviously can't download additional files.
Hmm.
Like, so if you find a bunch, you can't look for similar files to what you've uploaded, and you can't download any files that you find that may be related.
I gotcha.
That's the limitation that you get on the free side.
And I can
As
upload
far as
I can upload PDFs and Word docs and stuff.
Yep.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't have an example. We actually do
Yeah.
something called visual similarity analysis on the construct of PDFs.
Hmm.
So, have you ever seen those PDFs that get past your mail filter because they're not malicious, but they just contain a link to click here to choose your fish?
Yep.
So we actually can find huge clusters of that based on visual similarity analysis, which is a derivative of a new feature called icon pivoting. So that's a unique to PDFs,
Yeah.
but we're
Okay.
working on that for other formats. But yeah, you can upload Word, any Word, HWPs if you're particular to Korea. You can upload in pages, which is very popular in the Middle East.
Hmm.
Any type of format you can imagine, we can parse, and we handle over 150 different file
Gotcha.
types.
Okay. Awesome.
Yep. And even just uploading arbitrary binary, scanners will still be able to potentially make a decision about that, even though if it's malformed, you may still get results.
Right. Yeah, because
Just
it doesn't
because,
have to be necessarily a valid binary, right? Is your point? It's looking for certain things inside the binary, not whether it works or not.
correct. So we'll move on. So VirusTotal Intelligence is now rolling under VirusTotal Enterprise. And this comes with a number of new features. As I've discussed before, now VT Hunting is split out and rolled in under this. The VTv3 API is rolled in under this, and Graph is rolled in under this. So what we've done is we've extended faceted search. So I will go over what faceted search means in a little bit, but basically it just means any modifier. So, hey, any metadata, any files that contain metadata this, or any files that contain signature this, that's a faceted search for us. That now goes back over about a year. So it's about a petabyte of data, somewhere between 3 to 400 million samples, give or take. Depends on how good or bad each day is, right? We now also have something called content search, and this is the ability to search for arbitrary patterns, either strings in ASCII or Unicode, or arbitrary hex patterns, 4-byte minimum because they're stored in 4-byte shingles, using our new ngram search. So you can say, hey, show me any file on VirusTotal in the last year that contains Paul, the string Paul,
Mm-hmm.
and we can find all of those. And I'll show that off in a little bit using a very specific PDB. So a malware author didn't strip the PDBs when they compiled their malware, so it's really useful to find more of their stuff. I went over icon pivoting. I went over PDF visual similarity
Mm-hmm.
search. We'll go over some of the new relationships. Something that I have heard a lot of and I have experienced personally is managing all of your Yara rules, all your hunting rules via the UI is very slow. We now offer that all via API. You don't even have to use the UI at all to manage your Yara rules or your notifications. And we have a completely new interface. We hadn't updated our interface in about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it was about time to join the modern era of the internet. So, yeah. So we'll move on. So really what the goal here is we're working towards better defenses. That's what we want to offer fundamentally. We really want to be able to build your context of the alerts. We want to understand what else should I be looking for. And we want to pivot from one to many on indicators because typically an attack is not single stage, right? Or it's never just that one alert is the entire context of an attack. So we need to understand what else is going on. And we want to be able to correlate between multiple indicator types. Not everybody has great endpoint visibility. Not everybody has great network visibility. If you can juxtapose between those two types of indicators that are specific to each, i.e. hashes, IP addresses, URLs, and domains, we can get a much better idea of what types of indicators you can use in your environment. And then we'll skip to the next slide, as it is a good indicator of what I just talked about. So we'll start from 0 with the next use case. We'll go to the next slide. So this is our investigative use case in how do I search for VirusTotal? And this seems fundamental, but there are some new functionalities here. You can see the new file tab. That's where you upload anything you want. You can get those scans from our AV partners. From the URL tab, domains, IPs, URLs, you can upload that, you can copy paste that into the form and get it scanned via our engines and get results. And now you can also search. So you can search by hash, URL, IP, or domain and just get results. Now, this is for paid subscribers. This is our query builder, the next tab. This is for basically a Mad Lib style how to build complex faceted queries. So I want file types that are only PEDLLs that are 64-bit. I want with only 3 or more detections. I want minimum file size to be 15 kilobytes, maximum file size to be 45 kilobytes. I want antivirus label to say contain cobint. And I want, say, file metadata is some arbitrary string. That would be a pretty good search for actually finding cobint from the Cobalt Gang guys, the Fin7 guys, one of the most prolific and successful financial malware groups out there. Almost at this point, you could basically call them financial APT, and that's probably a pretty accurate label for them.
That's awesome.
And then we'll go over search modifiers in the next slide. These are just faceted search terms, so you can basically combine them together and say, hey, I want to know, hey, just is Cafe Babe, which is a pretty common string in certain raw hex for certain malware families or certain test files. I want to find all of these. And I also want to find anything that has the behavior gate.php, which those of you who have looked at malware in the last 10 years will recognize what gate.php is from, although it's used in a number of families. It was first popularized by Pony, which is a very, very popular stealer or backdoor Trojan. It's usually called a downloader as well. And then you can search for things like doc metadata. So very commonly you have unique metadata embedded into malicious documents, and you can pivot on that metadata to find more of that malicious document.
So, Brandon, would a use case be that I'm analyzing some malware sample offline, and then I think it's malware, but I want to go, I've got a couple of these like pieces of information that I've discovered in the malware, and I want to go see what other types of malware might have those same characteristics. Is that
absolutely either from a reverse engineer perspective, say, hey, I found a particular function that is interesting, or I found particular strings or Unicode that is interesting, or I see this particular behavior. In the case of, say, Pony, which is the example here, gate.php is kind of a gimme. So that's a pretty easy way to see, hey, what's going on here. And then ditto for the content metadata. I can
Yeah.
pivot to additional samples that are related.
I see. So I could see something in my logs somewhere, right, where I'm like, that kind of looks like malware, and it's maybe requesting a URL or requesting something specific. I can then go search for that and get the types of malware if I don't have a malware sample from one of my systems.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Awesome.
You can do that. That's a very common use case for people as well. And then, so we'll go on to the actual examples here. And this is just a really simple example of just searching for TrickBot. This is TrickBot from mid-October. It was a pretty large campaign, several 100,000 spam emails that went out to deliver this sample. And then it's as simple as searching for just the hash. In this case, I'm going to use SHA-256. I will harangue vendors that use MD5 because collisions are trivial.
Yeah, because collisions. Yeah.
They're not just because collision; they are trivial at this point. It is not a good way. So we'll move on. So this is what the details looks like in a for a subscriber. We see this detail tab and we see this imp hash. And an imp hash is just an expression of, hey, the import table and the list of DLLs and their functions that are being imported are the same. This is just a hashed expression of that value there. So I have an inkling that this imp hash might be shared across a number of other TrickBot samples. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and just pivot. So we'll go to the next slide and show, hey, I found 7 more samples from just the one, just based on that imp hash. And you can copy paste imp hash as a modifier and just paste in the hash, or you can just click on it and one-click search, however you want to do it. And again, obviously, if you're doing this by API, then you just add a faceted search to that. So already I've found 7 more samples of TrickBot from my one. Okay, let's see if we can do better. Now we're going to try to pivot on an embedded icon. And this isn't always an indicator that something is the same, but in this case, actually, the embedded icon of this TrickBot sample is kind of like it's kind of a broken version of the Adobe Acrobat icons, like hyper zoomed in if you look. It's kind of like if you look at like the bottom left corner of the Adobe Acrobat PDF format icon, that's what this is. So this icon got embedded in the TrickBot samples that they built. And pivoting on that, I found over 80 different TrickBot samples that use this identical icon. So now from one, I'm at 80. Okay, that's pretty cool. That gives me a pretty good idea of things that I could sweep my endpoints for. I could sweep my sandbox systems for, indicators for, or just search for additional context around. So instead of just saying, hey, I got caught by this sample, am I seeing anything else? I can now find a metric crap ton more. And now we'll go over what is called VTgrep, the content modifier, in the next slide. So I read a report that came out, I believe it was from the Virus Bulletin conference, but I'm not 100% sure, about a particular version of TrickBot that was called Anchor TrickBot. It seemed to be a test iteration of the malware, but they didn't include any samples, or they didn't include enough samples in their report, but they did helpfully include this PDB string, which they actually used to name Anchor TrickBot. Malware researchers and threat hunters are pretty lazy when naming things. Usually, if we can find unique strings that are in the file, we will probably use that as part of the name. So in this case, we have this Anchor PDB, and we searched on that. So show me any files for the last year that contain this PDB string, and lo and behold, I found 15 of them, which is way more than what I had previously. So now I can do some analysis and understand, hey, what does this cluster represent as far as new improved functionality? Why have they iterated on this? So this is useful for a interesting for a researcher point of view to understand, hey, these are the latest cutting edge threats. I just saw a blog on this. Let's find more. So we'll move on to alert triage. And this is one that was near and dear to my heart because I have been a SOC analyst. And hi, Allie. Sorry, that's my wife's.
No worries.
She's now
Hi, Allie.
internet famous, and my dog is now in the room, so we'll see how this goes. So we'll go on to the next slide. So how are we going to start with? This is very typical from a SOC analyst workflow, right? You get a piece of malware, you get a URL, you get an IP, and you need to make a decision, right? I need to understand, hey, is this bad? Is this good? What do I do? And we're going to use VTI metadata to help make those decisions. And we'll move on, and we're going to use a very typical Emotet dropper doc. So the next slide will show what that will look like. So this is the typical Emotet dropper doc. This was from mid-November, about 2 weeks ago. So very, very recent. Though Emotet changes their constructs very, very rapidly, um, you can find hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of these types of docs in there. So okay, if I'm just looking to triage and look and say if this is good or bad, like you did in your earlier example, yeah, this looks like a macro. This looks like a macro doc.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I could close my case here and say, okay, this is a macro dropper. But let's go to the next slide and get a better idea of what we're actually looking at. So let's look at the first submission and last submission. First submission gives us an idea of when this might have been relevant. So we know this was actually relevant on the 13th rather than the 23rd. Like it was likely a re-upload on the 23rd, and that it was just it, and that it was actually from a campaign on the 13th. So it's likely that we need to go back even further in our logs to even assess this activity.
Hmm.
Additionally, we have some of the names in the wild. So sometimes you can sweep by name, which is useful, but although not unique. But it is a useful construct for saying, hey, has anybody seen these type of documents? Can I regex this and look through my logs and see, hey, any pay number blah this pattern? Am I seeing any of this? Any mutations there? And then here you see the macros and VBA code streams, and we can see it doesn't have a legit name, so that's fun. Usually macros have a pretty labeled name, a fairly labeled name if they're legit, although legit macros to me is kind of an oxymoron. So that's something. But one of the things that we also have pulled out of here is that this macro is capable of running a file. And at this point, I can make the decision of, okay, so this is a macro document. It's been submitted. It has multiple names that are associated with the document. So that's already pretty odd. And the macro itself has the capability to run a file. What do you expect from a malicious macro? You expect the ability to download a file and run a file. So here I know, or I can make the pretty good guess that, hey, this is a malicious macro that is going to try and download and run a file. All from just metadata.
Mm.
And then we'll go ahead and check out the next slide and get a better idea.
Brandon, that .cls file, that's something that it's downloaded and then executing? And that's
that's actually the extracted macro stream.
Okay.
That's part of the macro itself, and you can download that as well.
Gotcha.
I didn't expand it in this screenshot because it's really nasty looking, and you're not going to be able to decode it
Gotcha.
just by eyesight. So yeah, that's what you're getting there. So the next slide, this is a relational view for subscribers that you'll see. Okay, here are all of the URLs it beacons out to, and those URLs in the bottom left are actually the C2s for Emotet, the binary, and then you see all the in the wild URLs as well. So we get a better idea of, hey, where does this come from? If I can't see it by hash, can I see it on the edge? Can I see it from my email logs? Can I see it from my my gateway logs? And then finally, the contacted IPs get related to the ASN as well. So you get a better idea of, hey, is this coming from a nasty ASN? Is this coming from a compromised place? So, hey, a lot of people will arbitrarily block nasty ASNs, wherein sometimes they will just say, hey, this looks good. We'll just keep rolling. And then you'll see a graph view up top, and this is just a relationship between the different nodes. And I will show an expanded out view of that graph in just a moment. So we'll move on to the investigative use case of IOC expansion and pivoting. And the scenario here is that we're going to start from a malicious domain. And we want to know, are there more indicators here? From an IR perspective, I don't just want that one alert. As a SOC analyst, sure, you handed me that alert that says, okay, this is bad, we need to deal with it. As an IR guy, I need to understand the full context of what's happening here so that I can actually remediate this event appropriately. So I want to find, are there more indicators? Is this related to C2 activity? And what else is this domain maybe linked to? And so we're going to do that by going over graph and some VTI reports. So next slide, we're just going to pivot on the domain. And I should have picked a domain I could pronounce. So I'm not going to try to pronounce that. But this was a domain that we saw on the edge, and it looks like we have a number of URLs that have been scanned and have pretty solid detection. So this indicates that, hey, we've seen this in a number of different campaigns over a number of different days. And then we have some files that may be referring to it as well. So we know that Emotet has used PDFs with links in them to download their next stage. So this is pretty expected behavior as well. So we'll move on and get a better idea of what's going on. We also see that this domain has downloaded a bunch of files as well. I think that's really zoomed in. Oh, pivot on domain. So there should be one more pivot on domain slide. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Sorry.
we also have the No, you're fine. I had to look at it and be like, what am I looking at? So we have these downloaded files as well. So these are things that VirusTotal has observed being downloaded from this domain. So these are what you could possibly assume are second stage payloads. And then we have on the right as first stage payloads, these are things that communicated with that domain. So it's an important distinction to make.
Yep.
That, hey, this came from the domain, this has spoken to the domain. And in this case, we actually have both instances. So that's pretty interesting. It seems like this domain has been used for some pretty broad spectrum activity.
Yeah, this domain is bad, right? Because the detections tell you that the stuff that it was downloading and the stuff that was the initial dropper file are all basically both really bad in terms of the percentage of detections.
Yeah, if I was triaging this, I would fire this over to my edge firewall team and block it, and then I would look for my logs to see if anything has been talking to it.
Gotcha.
Because I can now make a decision of, hey, things are getting downloaded from that are malicious, and things are talking to this that are malicious. Now, let's go ahead and pivot on the specific URI we observed. Now, this actually relates directly to specific macro documents that are emotet. So now we have the files that are related to this specific URI, and this is one of the downloader URIs. Your listeners may or may not be familiar, so I'll explain how emotet sort of does their things. They usually have a list of about 30 to 40. It can range between 15 and 40 URIs that they download their second stage payload to. And what they do is they randomly select from a list 3 of them and embed them into those documents. So all of these documents may have additional URIs that we haven't seen before, but they all have this one URI. So it's something just to keep in mind that not every macro doc has all of the URIs that may be in use for a current campaign. So here we see 5 of them. They're all relatively consistent as far as size, as far as being detected as malware, and being observed as macros. We'll go ahead and expand on graph in the next slide. So just by simply typing in the URL into or copy pasting it into VTgrep, and this is actually free for any user that has an account. What you would miss for those that are not subscribers is the ability to set this graph to private so that only you and your organization can see it, and you can't pivot on specific faceted searches. But this view right here, you can see just as a free user logged in and just by typing in this domain and just dropping it down. So here we see a relationship between the downloaded files, the communicating files, the referrer files, the resolutions, and the URLs as well. This is the same data we went over in the previous 3 slides, just represented in a more visual form. Some people really like this sort of visual analysis. So we now offer this type of view as well. And then with the little icon to the right, you can save this graph, and you can download all the indicators in this graph and just copy paste that into whatever you want for search or for whatever. And you even clicking on that button, you can pivot directly back into VTI for additional data.
And does it indicate if they're malicious or not, like downloaded and communicating? Like, can you hover or click and get the detections? I'm assuming.
So you can click on any of them or hover over any of them and get a verdict just like you would in the UI. So you can get an idea.
I can see why people like that, because in one screen you can basically see everything and then hover over it. Yeah, that's really nice.
Yep, and then it's pretty cool as well. If you select any of these relational nodes, so like that node that's labeled downloaded files or that node that's enabled communicating files, subscribers can then click something called commonalities, and it will show all the metadata commonalities between those files.
Wow.
So you can sort of one-click rule generation, which is pretty cool. So we'll go ahead and expand this graph and make it look a little more nasty because emotet is never this nice. So what I've done is I have pivoted on some of the downloaded files, and I've expanded on the communicating files, and then I've expanded out, hey, all these files now, what else do they communicate to? And here you see just one iteration of that. I can go many, many deeper because that's just the nature of this beast. But this is an example of just one iteration of, okay, what else can I find on this graph just by clicking? So you see a lot more indicators here that are all related to the same campaign.
Yeah, it makes me think that trying to detect the URL is pretty tough. It looks the URLs are changing a lot, right?
Yeah, they usually run one to two campaigns a day, somewhere between often between 40 and 100 unique URLs. It can be ridiculous,
Mm,
and you're not only are you looking at the in the wild URLs where the dropper docs come from, you also need to examine what they're pulling a payload from. So there's two different sets of
different URLs. Yeah.
URLs you can
Yeah.
block, and you need to make the distinction. Okay, I am popped, and i.e. they have executed a macro on my system and they're downloading a payload, or I have just seen this in the wild. Those are very different work paths.
Mm,
And that data is here. You can understand, hey, this is a file that communicates with it or contacts that URL, and this is what's been downloaded there. So you can get a better idea of what's going on just by sort of analyzing the context of what you're seeing. And we'll move on to the near and dearest, although people think this is like some black magic. And threat hunting isn't. It's really just science. I have some bad stuff, and I want to find. I have things that I know are bad or I suspect are bad. Can I find that in my network? Can I demonstrate this hypothesis that yes, this bad stuff is in my network, or no, this bad stuff is not in my network? So in this case, we're going to go over a piece of malware. The next slide. We're going to go over a single piece of malware or family, and we want to know, are there other variants of this? How old is my malware? And are there other targets? And we're going to do that using Yara, which is a open source rules language that is written by Victor Alvarez and several others of VirusTotal. It's been around for a very long time. And we're going to do this by using RetroHunt and Hunt. And the tool we'll use is Yara to express these types of rules and patterns.
mm-hmm.
And I'll go over what Yara is really quickly in the next couple of slides. So Yara is just a tool to assist malware researchers identify and classify malware. We can do this by identifying malware in strings or binary patterns. And the most simple Yara rule is just strings and a condition. And we'll go over that in the next slide. So the next slide shows a very simple rule. You have, actually this rule isn't valid. You'd actually have to label before sample rule, sample rule. Because it's a declaration. It's like a verb that in any programming language.
Yeah. So this is just a code snippet, not the whole.
Yeah, this is just a code snippet. Actually, this rule would work just fine if you just put rule right in front of that sample rule thing, because then you would define it as a rule. All you're doing is saying, hey, either string A, malicious string, or string B, which is just this hex pattern, needs to be true. If a file matches that condition, fire this alert, fire this rule. Very simple, very straightforward. The documentation is at yara.readthedocs.io, and it's linked to from VirusTotal. There's tons of documentation. It's very verbose. And let's go into what we're going to look at now. So the next slide, we'll go over some of the things that we're going to look at as far as Cobint. So this is a malware family that is in use by Fin7, Cobalt Gang. It is a memory resident implant. It is a DLL that is typically less than about 30 kilobytes in size. The older versions are between about 11 and 18 kilobytes in size. Some of the newer versions are just under 30 kilobytes in size. So we're going to be generous and give them 30 kilobytes to work with. We think that the imp-hash might be shared just because we have seen a number of very similar function calls. And that those function calls themselves are actually pretty interesting. So we're going to go under some of these premises and start building a rule here. So in the next slide, we're going to look at the strings side by side. And here we see the telltale sign of the older version of this malware, which is int.dll. This is actually why this was named Cobint. They just took this three-letter DLL and combine it with Cobalt Gang, which is the group that uses this tool. So that's pretty interesting. So we'll go ahead and select that as something there, and it's shared in both of them. Then we also have a next string, which is reflective loader, and this is the trick that it uses to load itself into memory. For more details on reflective DLL loading, it's very well documented. It's a technique that's been around for many years. It is likely that this technique was borrowed from the Cobalt Strike framework, though I'm not 100% sure of that. Cobalt Gang, for background, was actually named for their usage of Cobalt Strike's beacon tool, off-the-shelf tool. So that was their original naming scheme. They still use it, but they have moved away to more custom implants that are based on that code base. And then obtain user agent string isn't in itself malicious. All it's actually doing is just querying the registry and grabbing the default user agent string for the system. But it is unusual in this context for this DLL. So we're going to go ahead and take that as well as an interesting string. So we'll move on and take a look at some of the imp-hash stuff. All right, so I've looked at both samples, and they both have this identical set of imports in the same order, and they're calling the same functions. And we're gonna recognize that by using the imp hash as an expression of that. So we're gonna go ahead and grab that imp hash and use that.
So the imp hash is a unique identifier that relates to the DLLs that this binary is importing and the function calls it's making within those DLLs.
Correct. The imp hash is just a MD5 or I believe MD5 or SHA-1 of the sorry, that is an MD5 of the import table in the PE. So basically what happens is you walk the PE,
Mm-hmm.
you get the start of that section, then you get the end of the import section, and you just run a hash over
I
that
gotcha.
binary
Yep.
right there. And then you get this right here. Just like hashing any full file,
Mm-hmm.
same idea. Here you're just hashing a known segment of the file.
Gotcha. That's awesome.
Yep.
And
Yep.
MD5 is appropriate for this. I know you kind of poo-pooed MD5 before.
It's fine. It's significantly more difficult to it's significantly more difficult to generate a collision here than it is
Yes.
for a file itself.
Right.
It is possible, but even then, if you are creating a collision, you still have to have a very specific set of imports that you're using.
Mm-hmm.
So that even in and of itself, that is an interesting thing to analyze.
Gotcha.
So we'll move on. So here's all the interesting strings.
Mm-hmm.
Now we are going to have our first string is int.dll. I know it's ASCII. The second string, reflective loader, I know it's ASCII. Now the next string is obtain user agent string. By default, it actually assumes it's ASCII. So for the first two, I don't actually need to specifically state that as ASCII. So in this case, we're just going to leave it off. It's just a rules convention. You can leave it off if it's specifically ASCII, but I wanted to show both those features. If it was Unicode, I would just put a wide modifier.
Mm-hmm.
If it was both ASCII or Unicode, I would put ASCII wide. That's the case where you'd use ASCII and wide. In this case, we want them to be case sensitive, so we don't have to add any modifiers here. You can have a no case modifier. So if for example, you're looking for obfuscation of PowerShell, where they change the case of PowerShell all the time, doesn't matter. You can just put no case, and you'll find PowerShell in any mutation of cases. So we'll move on. Let's go ahead and construct the full rule. And this looks way scarier than it is, I promise. So first, we're going to import the PE, the PE library. And this is just a function for us to actually walk over some PE sections. In this case, this is what we're going to use to take the import hash start of that table, the end of that table, and hash it. And we're going to express that lower. Here, we're also defining this rule as APT. I know this is APT because it is generally specifically targeted. People will probably argue with me that this is crimeware. It has a specific FIN group, according to FireEyes, so this is pretty close to APT, financially motivated APT. I know it targets Windows, so I labeled it Windows. I know that it's called Cobint, and I know that I'm specifically looking for the DLL here. So this is just a way for me to label my rules so I understand what the hell the rule is telling me.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, I'm going to tag this as Cobalt Group. This is related to Cobalt Group. So I can have a bunch of rules that are related to Cobalt Group that are looking for different facets or different tools, which I do. So that makes finding things a lot easier. Here we have the strings just copy pasted. Anything that's double slash is a comment, like in, I believe, C++ and numerous other languages. And then we have our condition. Here we have the first 2 bytes are equal to MZ, and this is little endian, so it's actually reversed. That's just the magic bytes of a PE executable, a portable executable file. The first 2 bytes should be MZ. That just makes scanning a lot faster. All it has to do is examine the first 2 bytes. Hey, are the first 2 bytes MZ? No, move on. It is an optimization alone. The time saved is not that large. There was a study about that recently, but it does. But every little bit helps when you're scanning 150 terabytes of samples. Now the conditions are pretty simple. All of these strings are true, or that imp hash is there. So the imp hash that imp hash is true, and the file size is less than 30 kilobytes. So anything that's more than 30 kilobytes, we're going to discard. Now let's go ahead and look at some of the results. I went ahead and retro hunted this, and we have about 8 or 9 results. I skipped a slide. So here is what it looks like, just copy pasted into a retro hunt. Just copy paste your rule and run the retro hunt. Takes a few hours, but it crawls over about 150 petabytes of data. Or sorry, petabytes, terabytes. Apologies, 150 petabytes in that time would be ridiculous. Apologies.
So this is searching VirusTotal for files that have these characteristics.
Correct.
Okay.
And right now, this is 90 days. By the end of the year, this will be a full year. So instead of 150 terabytes of data, it'll be something along almost a petabyte of data in the same time period.
Hmm.
So it is an enormous amount of historical data. And and this is not based on compile time of the PE or anything. This is when the file was last scanned. So if an old file was rescanned for whatever reason, which happens all the time, it will see old files as well. But anything that has been seen by VirusTotal in the last year, by the end of the year, will be scannable using RetroHunt.
Hmm.
This is a subscriber function. So just paste your rule or your set of rules into RetroHunt and click go, and you will get results. Here I have 16 matches, and I can either download the entire list of them or I can just go to the results. And I've opted to go to the results in the next slide. So here we see a bunch of cobalt samples from various time periods. So we have them from dating back from July all the way to September, and some that have been seen in October. They changed the patterns a little bit, so I've actually updated this rule since. But effectively, this is a good example of how to find historical malware samples of, okay, I have an idea of what this looks like. Let's find more of this. So I found a bunch of samples. Note the one that's 0 of 62. It actually won't execute. It's malformed, and I believe that's why it has poor detection at this point, because the detections were at the time based on heuristics. So we'll move on and take a look at what this would look like for live hunt. Now, live hunt is I can put a rule in to VirusTotal and say, anytime a file is uploaded to VirusTotal or rescanned by VirusTotal, trigger this alert.
Hmm.
That matches one of my rules, trigger this alert. And this is a very common use case for hunters. I want to see when a new Cobalt sample is uploaded. I want to see when a new plugx sample is loaded or is uploaded or rescanned. And here I have some Cobalt group alerts from basically rescans in the last month. These look to be rescans, judging by when they were first observed, March 26, 2018. But they were rescanned on November 20th for whatever reason. So I got alerts for them. And I have hundreds upon hundreds of rules in Live Hunt right now. I get tens of thousands of alerts a day. That's all manageable via API. You can get super verbose data from the API endpoint. And do you have time for one more bonus case?
Yeah, quickly.
Okay, so this is the Fast Cash campaign. For those of you who are familiar with it, this was something that was pushed out by the DHS, collective effort by DHS FBI, for about a suspected ATM bank out. And they did a really good malware analysis. This happened in India at a bank called Cosmos. And the post hoc is the next slide. We have this backdoor, this Trojan. The next slide. So we're pivoting on this Trojan, and we're going to take a look at, hey, can we find anything else that may not have been mentioned on this report? And in the next slide, we actually find an interesting piece of data that was omitted from the report. This malware that was used was signed. So we can actually pivot on this serial number and find potentially see if we can find more malware based on that. So let's go ahead and pivot on that.
I like that you found more information than was in the original report. I think that's really cool.
Oh,
Like, it makes me want to
happens all the time.
go look at reports that come out and go verify them. Not verify them, but dig deeper in VirusTotal. Just, I don't know, because it sounds really fun.
All the time, man. Like,
Yeah.
I do that every single day. Every
It's
report
awesome.
that comes out, I guarantee you can find stuff that's older or maybe additional related things. It's
Yeah.
a ton of fun, and that's sort of how we sort of build our hunting corpus, right?
Hmm.
So we found a bunch of samples that are related. The first highlighted sample is the original one. The one below it that's not highlighted is actually the 64-bit version, which is also in the report. But the fourth one down that is highlighted is actually the same tool, but it was not covered in the report at all.
Hmm.
And interestingly, if we look at some of the submission data in the next slide, it overlaps with targeting from the original malware. Now, this malware was seen in the wild. The original one was seen in the wild at the end of December 2017. So these guys were in that bank network for just under a year to observe what was going on. Now, this sample was first seen by us in March 2018, and is identical to those samples that were seen in 2017. And the targeting is very, very similar because Cosmos Bank has obviously is based in India and has some branches in Hong Kong. I'm not sure about Nigeria, but this is interesting in that the targeting and that where it was first seen, in the next slide, where you can see submitter data, is actually pretty unique there. And just some evidence of, hey, this is the exact same sample on the next slide. Just do a strings comparison. If you look at the unpacked version of the sample from US CERT, you actually see that the sample we found is identical. It has the same strings. This is the same tool. So that's pretty interesting. Those of you who will get the slides, then I have included a rule to just pivot on this. So this is a rule just to see, hey, if this cert gets used again, here you go. For more information about how these guys constructed this attack, basically they took this malware, it was a backdoor, and they observed the network. When they cashed out, most ATMs have rudimentary anti-fraud stuff, and they will say, hey, Mr. Payment processor, do you want me to complete this transaction? What these guys is they put a piece of malware, a proxy malware, in between the payment access network and the ATMs that said, hey, Mr. ATM, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. So all these guys had to do was just dump a bunch of cloned debit cards into the ATMs and just cash out. And the fraud, even though the ATM was saying it was fraud, the proxy was returning, oh no, the payment access network says this is fine. Keep going, keep going, keep going.
Wow.
And that requires a significant amount of reconnaissance and understanding of how that payment access network works. So it is totally plausible that these tools were there for quite a long time. And the next bonus sample is well explained, so we'll go ahead and skip that one.
Okay.
And we'll go to the takeaways. So here, what we really wanted to do was move from triage to response to hunting. Move up the different tiers of specialization, and understand where the use cases are for each of those. We're using VTI to gain context, and we really just want to pivot from one to many and build out our attacker IOCs. If you have just one IOC, all you're looking at is a single spec in time, a single point in time that indicates past badness. To get a complete idea of what's happening, you need context. You need to understand what else is going on. And then finally, we were able to search for malware historical context, like we just did with the fast cache malware, to see what else was signed, and like we did with the RetroHunt to find more COBINT samples. And thanks, Paul. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you having us on the show. And any questions, please feel free to email us or email the show, as Paul has mentioned earlier, and we will field those questions for any listeners.
Fantastic. Brandon, what is virustotal.com/learn? You guys have some training, kind of educational materials, right?
We do. We have some specific use cases. So we have the typical white papers on, hey, here are very specific use cases that we have gone over and we have built for you. We also have training, a training war game for the content, for the faceted searches, that guides you through how to use those searches and combine them together. Things like, I want to see files that were seen on this day, but not before this day. And their file size this, and has this metadata facet, and is this file type. It'll sort of start to expand out your horizons on how to use faceted searches. So that's called our war game as well. So there's a bunch of material there, and to understand what we've done with VirusTotal Enterprise, and a lot of different material there.
Awesome. Well, Brandon, thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
One last thing for free trials for enterprises or organizations that are looking to do trials, because sometimes you just need to get a better idea of what you're getting when you subscribe. Please contact us at info@virustotal.com. We can set up. We can discuss getting you guys a free trial. It's very easy. You get about 2 weeks of a trial to understand, hey, this is how much API I would use, this is how much UI I use, rather than just bucket buying a huge amount or a tiny amount and expending it all.
Fantastic. Brandon, thank you so much. It was nice having you on the webcast today. Fantastic information. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. We'll see you next time.